It was one of those long, wind-swept nights that made the station feel like the edge of the world. The last train had already gone, and the tracks shimmered faintly under the dim yellow lights that buzzed overhead. The metal rails hummed with the memory of motion. But everything else was still. The vending machine light flickered, a paper cup rolled quietly along the floor, and somewhere far down the platform, the sound of rain whispered against the roof. My name is John, 35 years old, night duty officer at this small, half-forgotten train station somewhere between two towns no one talks much about. I'd been doing this job for almost a decade now, and the silence had become both a comfort and a punishment. Every night I'd watch travelers come and go, lovers parting, friends reuniting, strangers brushing past each other with stories I'd never know. And then there was me, standing there in uniform, making sure no one slipped, no one stayed behind, no one broke the rules. The nights had their rhythm. The last whistle, the final rush of passengers, the sudden emptiness after. And in that emptiness I often caught myself thinking about what I'd lost, about the man I once loved and how quietly he'd walked out of my life, taking with him the only warmth I'd known in years. Since then, I'd grown used to the quiet, used to being the man who helped others find their way home while I stayed behind. That's when I noticed him. He was sitting on one of the wooden benches near platform 3, his bag beside him, his hands clasped tightly as if to keep warm. The boy couldn't have been more than 25. Messy brown hair, fair skin that looked a little too pale under the station lights, and eyes that wandered the floor like he was lost in thought. There was something fragile about him, something that didn't belong to the cold metal and concrete around us. I hesitated for a moment before walking over. "You all right, kid?" I asked, keeping my voice low so it didn't echo. He lifted his head slowly, startled, then offered a small, uncertain smile. "Yeah, I'm fine. He glanced toward the empty tracks. "I missed the last train." I nodded. "Next one's not till morning. That's a long wait in this cold." He shrugged, though I could see the tremor in his shoulders. "It's fine. I'll manage." There was something in his tone, polite, distant, but heavy with exhaustion. I studied him a little longer, noticing how his lips were slightly pale, how he rubbed his hands together like someone fighting off a fever. He looked unwell, maybe hungry too. "You don't look too good," I said quietly. "There's a heater in the waiting office if you want to warm up, or I can make you some tea." He seemed to hesitate. His eyes, soft and gray with a tired depth, searched mine as if trying to decide whether to trust me. Then he said something I didn't expect. "You really shouldn't be this kind to strangers." The words hung between us, simple but sharp, cutting through the cold air. I almost smiled, though there was no humor in it. "Maybe," I said, "but someone's got to be." He looked away, his fingers tightening on the strap of his bag. "You don't even know me." "True," I replied, "but you look like you could use a bit of warmth. That's enough for me." He studied me again, and for a brief moment, something flickered behind his tired eyes. Surprise? Maybe gratitude? Maybe something I couldn't quite name. Then he nodded faintly. "My name's Eli," he said softly. "I guess a cup of tea would be nice." As he stood and followed me toward the dimly lit office, I couldn't help but glance back at the bench where he'd been sitting. His body had left a faint imprint on the wood, like the echo of someone who didn't plan to stay long. And though I didn't know it then, that night, that small act of kindness on a quiet platform would change everything. The night air outside bit at our faces as we stepped out of the platform office. The station was almost asleep now, lights dimmed, ticket windows shuttered, and the metallic groan of the rails stretching under the cold. Eli walked beside me quietly, his bag slung over one shoulder. I could see the faint shiver running through him with every gust of wind. "You can't stay out here," I said finally, breaking the silence. "It gets colder past midnight and the benches don't exactly make for a good bed." He gave a small, reluctant smile. "I've slept in worse places." "Not tonight," I replied firmly but not unkindly. "There's a small staff room near the east gate. It's nothing fancy, but it's warm and safe. You can rest there until morning." He hesitated like someone not used to accepting kindness easily. I don't want to trouble you. You're not, I said, unlocking the narrow side door. Just consider it company for the night. This station could use another heartbeat around. That earned me a faint laugh. He followed me through the dim corridor that led to my room, a space I'd lived in more than my own apartment. The door creaked softly as I pushed it open. The faint scent of coffee and old wood lingered in the air. It wasn't much. A single bed pushed against the wall, a small table cluttered with thermoses, train schedules, and an old radio that sometimes worked. A portable heater hummed near the corner, throwing a soft orange glow across the cracked linoleum floor. The sound of distant trains still echoed faintly through the walls, steady and rhythmic, like a heartbeat I'd grown used to over the years. Eli stood in the doorway looking around with cautious curiosity. You actually live here? I shrugged. More or less. I rent a flat in town, but I spend most nights here. It's quieter. He set his bag down gently. It's cozy, he said, though his voice carried a quiet sadness that caught me off guard. It wasn't just exhaustion. It was the tone of someone who'd been drifting too long. I motioned toward the bed. You can rest there. I'll be on duty most of the night anyway. Heater's right there if you need to adjust it. He looked at me for a moment as if trying to read something behind my words. Then he nodded. You really don't have to do this, John. I know, I said simply. But I want to. For a while, we just stood there in the warm silence of that small room. The soft hum of the heater filled the air. I poured him a cup of coffee from my thermos, handed it to him, and watched as he cupped it between both hands like it was something precious. He took a small sip, winced at the bitterness, then smiled. You make it strong. Habit, I said with a chuckle. Night shifts require it. He leaned against the wall, eyes half-lidded, the color slowly returning to his cheeks. You do this every night? Watch over an empty station? Pretty much, I said. It's quiet work. Peaceful most of the time. Doesn't it get lonely? His question caught me off guard. I glanced at him. His tone wasn't mocking, just genuinely curious. Sometimes, I admitted. But you get used to the quiet. It's predictable. I know when the trains come, when they go, and when everything stops. There's something comforting about that. He smiled faintly. You sound like someone who finds peace in routine. Or hides in it, I said before I could stop myself. Eli didn't say anything, but the way he looked at me, soft, understanding, made the silence feel intimate, not empty. After a moment, I asked, What about you? You said you're a traveler? He nodded. Yeah, I move from town to town. I paint, sometimes portraits, sometimes landscapes. Freelance, mostly. It's not the most stable life, but it keeps me moving. Sounds freeing. It can be, he said, his gaze distant. But freedom and loneliness sometimes look a lot alike. That line lingered in the room like a sigh. I wanted to ask him more, where he was headed, what he was running from, but something about his expression told me not to push. Instead, I nodded toward the heater. At least tonight you don't have to be either. He looked at me then, really looked, his gray eyes steady, thoughtful, and a little warmer than before. A small, genuine smile tugged at his lips. You're different, John, he said quietly. Most people don't notice others. The words hit me deeper than I expected. I tried to brush it off with a half smile. Maybe that's what night shifts do to you. You start noticing the things daylight hides. He chuckled softly, then set his cup aside and pulled the blanket over himself. Thank you, he murmured, his voice already fading into sleep. I watched him for a moment longer, the way his breathing slowed, the way the hard lines of his face softened in rest. There was something deeply human about that small act of trust, about letting yourself fall asleep in a stranger's room. When I finally turned to leave, the heater's soft hum followed me out into the hallway. The cold air bit at me again as I stepped back onto the platform, my radio crackling faintly at my side. I tried to focus on the distant lights and the empty rails ahead, but somewhere in the back of my mind, I kept thinking of the boy sleeping in my bed, and the strange warmth he'd brought into a night that had always been cold. By the time the clock in the main office struck 1, the station had sunk into complete silence. The world outside was still, the platforms ghostly in their emptiness. Only the faint hum of the fluorescent lights and the soft whisper of the wind passing through the steel beams broke the quiet. My shift had finally ended, And for once, I didn't feel the usual relief that came with closing my logbook. My thoughts kept wandering to the small room near the east gate, and to the boy sleeping inside. Eli. I didn't know why his name lingered in my mind the way it did, but it had followed me through every inspection, every report, every echo of the departing trains. Maybe it was because he seemed so out of place in this cold mechanical world. A soft, wandering soul resting in a space built for schedules and steel. Before heading to my quarters, I stopped by the tiny canteen near the exit. The attendant had gone home hours ago, but I still had access to the pantry. I made 2 sandwiches, poured some soup into a thermos, and brewed a cup of hot tea. It wasn't much, but it was something warm to wake up to. When I reached my room, the hallway was pitch dark except for the dull orange light spilling out from beneath the door. I hesitated for a moment, smiling to myself at the thought that Eli must have turned the heater higher. Then I turned the knob gently and pushed the door open without a sound. The room was dim, quiet except for the faint crackle of the heater. The air smelled of coffee and warmth, a stark contrast to the freezing platforms outside. My eyes adjusted slowly, and I noticed the blanket on the bed shifting slightly, rising and falling in an uneven rhythm. At first I thought he was shivering, maybe having a bad dream. I took a step closer, careful not to startle him. But then I froze. His arm was moving under the blanket, slowly, rhythmically, his fingers tracing some unseen pattern across his chest or stomach. His breathing was shallow, and a soft sound escaped his lips, half sigh, half whisper. I blinked, suddenly aware of the quiet thud of my heartbeat in the still air. My first instinct was to step back to give him privacy. Maybe he was dreaming, maybe something else. I didn't want to assume. Then, as I took another small step, I heard him mumble softly, his voice barely audible but clear enough to make me stop. "It's so yummy." For a second, I just stood there staring like an idiot. Then a quiet laugh escaped me before I could stop it, half amusement, half relief. The tension in my chest melted. He must be dreaming about food. Maybe the vending machine snacks I'd given him earlier. I set the thermos on the table and knelt by the bed, reaching out gently. "Eli," I said softly. "Hey, wake up. You're talking in your sleep." His eyes fluttered open slowly, confusion clouding them. When he realized I was there, standing over him, he sat up abruptly, the blanket falling away from his shoulders. His face turned a faint shade of pink. "Oh, John," he stammered, rubbing his eyes. I must have fallen asleep." I smiled, trying to ease his embarrassment. "You were dreaming," I said lightly. "Something about something being yummy?" His eyes widened a little more, and he groaned softly, covering his face with his hands. "Oh no. Please tell me I didn't say that out loud." "You did," I chuckled, shaking my head, loud enough for me to hear it from the door. He peeked at me between his fingers, laughing nervously. "God, that's embarrassing." "It's all right," I said. "I've heard stranger things during night shifts." The awkwardness between us melted into quiet laughter, the kind that feels both silly and intimate at once. The heater hummed softly, casting a warm glow across his face. He looked younger like that, his hair messy, his cheeks flushed with sleep. "I brought you something," I said, lifting the bag. "Thought you might be hungry when you woke up." He blinked, still smiling faintly. "You didn't have to do that. I know. But I figured you deserved something better than vending machine crackers." He took the sandwich and the thermos, his fingers brushing mine for a brief moment. There was a spark in that small contact, unexpected, unspoken, but I felt it linger. As he ate, I sat on the chair near the desk, the two of us quiet for a while except for the sound of him sipping soup. Then, out of nowhere, he said softly, "You're being awfully nice to me, John. Aren't you afraid of what I might be?" I frowned slightly. "What do you mean?" He hesitated, setting the cup down. His voice dropped quieter now. "I mean, I'm gay. I usually don't say that out loud to strangers, especially in towns like this." He glanced up at me, searching for a reaction. People don't always take it well. I studied him for a moment, then shook my head. "You don't have to hide who you are from me." He looked surprised. "Just like that?" "Just like that," I said. "You're a person who missed a train and needed somewhere warm to rest. That's all that matters tonight." For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then a small, grateful smile crept across his lips. "You're different, John." "I've been called worse," I said with a smirk. And that made him laugh again, soft, real. like the sound of something heavy finally being lifted. The clock ticked quietly on the wall as the night stretched around us. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like a man guarding an empty station. Sitting there, sharing food and laughter with this drifting artist, I felt like the silence finally had meaning. The heater in the corner hummed faintly, its orange glow spilling soft light over the cracked walls of my small railway room. Eli sat across from me, his knees drawn up to his chest, the blanket still loosely draped over his shoulders. The tea I'd brought him had gone cold between us, but neither of us seemed to care anymore. It was strange, how quickly the silence between two people could shift from awkward to something fragile, honest. He was the first to speak. "You live alone here, John?" I nodded. "Most nights, yes. My family's in another city. We don't talk much anymore." He tilted his head, studying me with those tired eyes of his. "And no one waiting for you at home?" I smiled faintly, shaking my head. "There was someone once, but that ended years ago." He didn't press for details, and I was grateful for that. Instead, the stillness of the night seemed to settle around us, gentle and patient, as if the world outside had paused just to let us talk. I found myself saying things I hadn't said in a long time, about how loneliness didn't always come from being alone, but from having no one who truly understood you, about how the station, despite being full of travelers, always felt like a place of departures, never arrivals. Eli listened quietly, tracing a circle on his mug with his thumb. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a soft tremor. "It's hard, you know. Being different. Being someone people decide not to understand." I looked up, meeting his gaze. "You mean being gay?" He nodded, not looking away this time. "Yeah, I don't usually say it out loud. Not to strangers, anyway." He laughed a little, though it sounded more like an exhale. "People don't take it well where I come from. It's easier to just move around, to keep being the guest, the traveler, the artist who never stays too long." I leaned back, the words sinking into me. There was something in his tone, tiredness maybe, but also defiance, the kind of strength that comes from surviving quietly. "I'm sorry," I said softly. "That sounds lonely." "It is." He smiled, small but sincere. "But tonight doesn't feel lonely. Maybe that's enough." The clock ticked softly between us. The sound of a distant train rolled through the night like a sigh. I watched him for a long moment, the way the light caught the curve of his face, the way his expression softened when he felt seen. "You know," I said quietly, "I think I understand that more than I should." He raised an eyebrow. "You," I shrugged. "I've built my life around duty, following the rules, doing what's right. But sometimes when it's past midnight and the station's empty, I wonder if I've been waiting for something without even knowing it." Eli smiled faintly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's not wrong to want someone who understands you even for one night." Something shifted in the air then, gentle, unspoken, real. I didn't move closer, and neither did he, but the space between us felt charged like a held breath. He looked down, his fingers tightening around his cup. "I'm sorry if that sounds forward, I'm tired of pretending that I don't care when I do." I shook my head. "Don't apologize." He met my eyes again, searching, uncertain. "You're a good man, John. You didn't have to offer me a room, or stay and talk. But you did." His sincerity caught me off guard. I felt the old ache in my chest again, the one I thought I'd buried years ago. The ache of wanting to be seen not as an officer, not as someone who helps others, but simply as a man. "I don't know what that makes me," I admitted quietly. "It makes you kind," he said, "and maybe a little lonely." We both laughed softly then, not because it was funny, but because it was true. Minutes turned into hours. Our conversation drifted from heavy truths to lighter things. His favorite cities, the murals he'd painted, the little cafe in Florence where he once fell in love with someone's laugh. And me. I told him about the small joys of this forgotten station, the rhythm of rain on tin roofs, the smell of coffee at dawn, the way the morning light hits the tracks just right. It felt good. Talking like that, real. When the clock struck 3, Eli's eyelids began to droop. He pulled the blanket tighter around himself, giving me a sleepy smile. "Thank you, John. For tonight." I nodded, unable to find words that didn't sound small compared to the feeling in my chest. He lay down, his breathing soon falling into a soft rhythm. I sat there for a while longer, watching the glow of the heater fade against the pale dawn creeping through the window. Something inside me had shifted. I didn't know what it meant yet, or if it was even meant to mean anything, but for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel completely alone. Rain began to fall sometime after 3. At first it was soft, a faint patter against the tin roof, but soon it became a steady rhythm that filled the silence between breaths. The world outside blurred into a wash of silver sound while, inside, the little railway room glowed with the tired hum of the heater. Eli stirred from sleep, his hair a little tousled, his expression dazed in the half-light. I was still sitting near the edge of the bed, my coat draped loosely around my shoulders. When he looked at me, there was no awkwardness. Just that quiet, familiar warmth that had grown between us without permission. "Is it raining?" he murmured. I nodded. "Pretty heavily. You'll hear the roof sing all night if it keeps up." He smiled faintly and pulled the blanket closer. "That's nice. I like the sound of rain. Makes you feel small, but safe somehow." I stood and adjusted the heater, turning it a little closer toward him. "You warm enough?" He hesitated, then nodded. "Yeah. Thanks." But I could see his fingers trembling slightly. The night had gotten colder, and the room, though small, wasn't built to hold heat for long. Without thinking too much, I picked up another blanket from the shelf and draped it over his shoulders. He looked up at me, his eyes soft. "You really are kind, John. Too kind, maybe." I smiled quietly, sitting back down beside him. "I just don't like seeing people cold." There was a pause, the kind that carried comfort rather than distance. Eli's breathing steadied, and after a moment he leaned in slightly, his head resting against my shoulder. The gesture was so natural, so human, that it didn't even feel strange. The warmth of his hair brushed my neck, and the scent of soap and faint rain filled the air. I didn't move. I didn't need to. We stayed like that for a while, listening to the rain whisper against the world outside. He spoke softly, almost as if afraid of breaking the quiet. "You ever think about how strange it is? How two people can meet by accident and suddenly, it feels like they've known each other longer?" I smiled, my voice low. "All the time. Maybe that's just how certain souls work. They recognize each other before the mind does." He chuckled, a gentle sound. "That's a beautiful way to put it." The heater crackled. The clock ticked softly in rhythm. The faint glow of the red bulb painted our shadows against the wall, still and quiet. We talked for a long time. About his travels, the places he'd seen, the little stories he'd gathered like postcards in his memory. I told him about the station, about the passengers I watched come and go every day, and how sometimes I envied their direction, even if I never wanted to admit it. And between those stories, there were silences. Comfortable, breathing pauses where neither of us needed to fill the space. His shoulder pressed lightly against mine, and I could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his heartbeat. When he spoke again, his voice trembled with honesty. "I've spent so long trying not to need anyone. But tonight, I don't know, John. It feels good to stop pretending for a while." I looked down at him. His eyes were glistening faintly in the dim light, though he wasn't crying. Just open. "You don't have to pretend here," I said quietly. "Not tonight." He smiled, his voice barely a whisper. For once I didn't feel like a stranger. Something in my chest tightened, that fragile ache of connection that was both comforting and unbearable. I wanted to say something right, but all that came out was a quiet exhale. We didn't speak after that. We just stayed. Two people who'd stumbled into the same night, sharing a silence that meant everything words couldn't. His breathing slowed, his head heavier against my shoulder. The rain softened into a steady drizzle, and the heater's light flickered gently against the walls. At some point I must have leaned back and he followed, half asleep, still close. His hand brushed mine under the blanket, and I didn't pull away. It wasn't passion or impulse that filled the room, but something deeper. That rare, wordless, understanding between two souls who'd both been lonely for far too long. The night stretched on like a dream. I could feel his warmth beside me, his quiet trust, and for the first time in years, the emptiness I carried felt lighter. As dawn began to push faint gold through the edges of the curtain, I found myself still awake, listening to the slowing rain. I turned my head just slightly and saw Eli asleep, peaceful, his lips curved in the faintest smile. I thought about how strange life was, how one missed train, one small act of kindness, could bring two people together in a way that defied logic. Sometimes I realized, love doesn't need to last forever to change you. Sometimes it just needs one night, one quiet, rain-soaked night, to remind you that your heart is still alive. The soft warmth of morning crept into the room, spilling across the small desk, the rumpled blanket, and the 2 cups from last night's tea. The rain had stopped hours ago, leaving behind a clean, shimmering silence that filled every corner of the little railway quarters. The world outside felt new, washed and golden. When I opened my eyes, the first thing I saw was Eli standing near the window, sunlight brushing over his face like a quiet farewell. His hair caught the light in soft strands, and for a second I almost forgot that he was leaving. He looked peaceful, the kind of peace you only see after a storm. He noticed me awake and smiled gently. "Good morning," he said, his voice still husky from sleep. "Morning," I replied, sitting up slowly. The air between us felt heavier somehow, warm but touched with the ache of goodbye. Eli bent down to close his bag, the sound of the zipper faint in the quiet. "My train leaves in half an hour," he said softly, glancing at me as if to test how I'd take it. I nodded, trying to return his smile. "You'll make it this time, huh?" He chuckled under his breath. "Yeah. Guess I can't miss 2 in a row." But neither of us laughed fully. We both knew that this morning wasn't like any other. The heater had gone cold and the faint smell of coffee still lingered in the air. I busied myself by pouring some water into the kettle, just to do something with my hands. He stood by the window looking out at the tracks gleaming with morning dew. "I don't know how to thank you," he said suddenly, turning toward me. "You didn't just give me shelter, John, you gave me peace. I haven't felt that in a long time." I didn't look up right away. The words hit deeper than I expected. When I finally met his eyes, I managed a small smile. "You don't need to thank me, Eli. Sometimes people just find each other when they need to." He held my gaze for a moment longer, something unspoken flickering between us. Not romance exactly, not attachment, but a quiet gratitude that felt just as strong. He walked closer then, stopping just a few steps away. "Still," he said softly, "I'll remember this night." "So will I replied. We stood there for a moment, uncertain how to bridge the space between us. Finally, I extended my hand. "Take care of yourself, all right? And eat something on the train this time." He looked at my hand, then took it. His grip was warm, steady. But instead of letting go, he stepped closer, closing the distance until our shoulders touched. Then gently he pulled me into a hug. It wasn't long, just a heartbeat's worth of closeness, but in that heartbeat everything we hadn't said seemed to pass between us. His head rested briefly against my shoulder, and I felt the faint tremble of his breath before he stepped back. "Goodbye, John," he said quietly. "Goodbye, Eli." The words felt final, yet kind. We walked together to the platform. The morning was bright now, the station slowly stirring to life. A few early travelers waited with their bags. A vendor arranged his teacups, and the air smelled faintly of coal and wet earth. When the whistle of the incoming train echoed down the tracks, Eli looked at me one last time. His smile was soft, wistful. "You really shouldn't be this kind to strangers," he said, echoing the words he'd spoken when we first met. I smiled faintly. "Maybe I just know which ones need it most." He laughed quietly, then turned as the train rolled in. The sound of its brakes hissed against the air, and for a moment, everything seemed to move slower, as if the world itself wanted to hold this goodbye just a little longer. He stepped onto the train, turned around at the doorway and waved once. I raised my hand in return, the sunlight catching his face for the last time. Then the train pulled away, the rhythmic clatter fading into distance until all that was left was the soft hum of the morning. I stood there long after it was gone, staring at the empty tracks. There was a strange lightness in my chest. Not sadness, not loss, but something gentler. Something like healing. The rest of the day passed in the usual rhythm of arrivals and departures. Passengers came and went, trains hissed and howled, and I went through the motions of duty. Yet every now and then, I'd catch myself glancing toward the bench where I'd first seen him, half expecting to find him sitting there again, smiling that small tired smile. That night, when the station fell quiet again and the lamps flickered in their steady orange glow, I went back to my room. I meant only to rest, to clear my head, but when I opened the door, I noticed something lying on the small desk near the window, a folded sheet of paper. My name was written on it in faint pencil strokes. For John. I opened it slowly. Inside was a sketch, delicate, soft, drawn with care. It was me. I was standing on the platform, hands in my pockets, the faint halo of the station light spilling over me. But it wasn't a technical drawing. It was emotional, alive. In the sketch, I was smiling. Not the polite smile of duty, but the rare kind that comes from somewhere honest. The light in the drawing made me look peaceful. At the bottom corner, he'd written one line. Thank you for making even one night feel like home. I sat there for a long time, the sound of distant trains filling the silence. My eyes lingered on the sketch until the lines blurred a little. Then I folded it carefully and placed it in my locker, not hidden away, but somewhere I'd see it each night before duty. Sometimes I still think of him, not with longing, but with quiet warmth. The kind that stays not because it demands anything, but because it reminded me of something true. He was just a traveler who missed his train, but found a place in my heart that will never depart.